In the dark corridors of history, few figures inspire such profound dread as Caligula, the Roman emperor who transformed the most powerful empire on earth into a theater of madness, brutality, and grandiose delusion. This is not merely a biography of a deranged ruler, it's a descent into the abyss of unchecked power, a chilling exploration of how a promising young leader could morph into a monster whose cruelty would make even the most seasoned torturer recoil in horror. What follows is a glimpse into the forbidden history that Rome desperately tried to bury, a tale so unsettling that ancient historians hesitated to recount it, fearing that even uttering his name might resurrect his malevolent spirit to haunt the living. It was the year 37 AD when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, forever known as Caligula, ascended to the Roman throne at the tender age of 24. The empire, forged through the disciplined legions and calculated ruthlessness of its predecessors, was poised to witness a 4-year descent into madness that would redefine the very essence of tyranny. The reign that began with such hope and promise was destined to devolve into an orgy of violence so extreme that it would shock a society well acquainted with crucifixions and gladiatorial combat. The historical record of this grim period is preserved by the most esteemed historians of antiquity, Suetonius, whose Lives of the 12 Caesars unveils the intimate and terrifying details of Caligula's excesses, Tacitus, the unparalleled chronicler of imperial corruption, and Cassius Dio, whose Roman history immortalizes the accounts of those who witnessed the emperor's insanity firsthand. These courageous individuals risked their lives to document the unfolding horror, understanding that future generations needed to learn how rapidly civilization could collapse under the crushing weight of absolute power. To truly grasp the depths of Caligula's depravity, we must first examine the poisoned soil from which this monstrous bloom arose. Born into the prestigious Julio-Claudian dynasty, young Gaius was raised in a world where murder was a political tool and survival depended on ruthless maneuvering. His great-grandfather was Augustus, the first Roman emperor who had masterfully established the Principate through calculated violence and political acumen. His grandfather, Tiberius, ruled through a suffocating atmosphere of fear and paranoia, while his father, Germanicus, enjoyed immense popularity among the legions, a popularity that may have ultimately led to his demise by poisoning. The childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, originated from his years spent amongst his father's legions on the Germanic frontier. Soldiers adored the small boy, dressing him in miniature military attire and allowing him to march alongside hardened veterans. This early exposure to the casual brutality of Roman warfare would later surface in his obsession with gladiatorial games and public executions. The innocent child who once captivated hardened soldiers would mature into a man who found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. His ascent to power was paved with the corpses of his family members. As Tiberius succumbed to paranoia in his later years, he systematically eliminated potential rivals to the throne. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled and left to starve to death, while his brothers, Nero and Drusus, were imprisoned and ultimately executed. Only Caligula's apparent harmlessness, his youth, and his reputation as a theatrical dilettante shielded him from sharing their fate. Tiberius famously remarked that he was nurturing a viper in the bosom of Rome, a prophecy that would prove tragically accurate. Upon Tiberius' death in 37 AD, perhaps hastened by Caligula himself, according to some rumors, the young prince inherited an empire that spanned from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. The Roman Senate, weary of Tiberius' reign of terror, greeted Caligula with genuine enthusiasm. Little did they know that they were exchanging one monster for another, one whose appetite for cruelty would make his predecessor seem like a benevolent patriarch. Caligula's initial months as emperor appeared to usher in a golden age for Rome. He generously distributed bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and the fire brigades, securing their loyalty with the tainted wealth of his predecessors. He recalled political exiles, freed prisoners, and made the imperial budget available for public examination, actions that earned him immense popularity among both the elite and the common people. The Roman people, starved for hope after years of Tiberius's oppressive rule, embraced their charismatic young emperor with a fervor that bordered on idolatry. He organized elaborate gladiatorial games and chariot races, spending lavishly on public entertainment that captivated the masses. The amphitheaters ran red with blood as exotic animals from across the empire were slaughtered for the amusement of the crowds, and the finest gladiators fought to the death in contests that lasted from dawn until dusk. Caligula himself presided over these spectacles with evident delight, his laughter echoing through the arena as men perished for his entertainment. What the crowd interpreted as generous patronage was, in reality, the first glimpse of his pathological fascination with violence and death. During this seemingly benevolent period, Caligula also completed several of Tiberius' unfinished construction projects and initiated new public works that provided employment for thousands of citizens. He restored the Theater of Pompey and commissioned a new amphitheater, monuments to Roman engineering that concealed the growing darkness within his soul. Foreign ambassadors reported that the young emperor possessed intelligence and eloquence, handling diplomatic matters with surprising skill for someone so young and inexperienced. Yet even during these early months, astute observers noted disturbing signs. Caligula's laughter during the gladiatorial games was too intense, too genuine, lingering long after the crowds had fallen silent. His eyes would follow the trails of blood as they pooled in the arena's sand, and palace servants whispered that he would sometimes return to the empty amphitheater at night, walking alone through the corridors where men had died just hours before. The seeds of madness were already taking root, nourished by the intoxicating power of absolute authority. 8 months into his reign, Caligula suffered a severe illness, a mysterious affliction that marked the definitive turning point from promising young emperor to the monstrous figure enshrined in history. Ancient accounts describe symptoms that modern medical experts have speculated could represent a range of conditions, from encephalitis to temporal lobe epilepsy. But the precise nature of his illness remains one of history's most fiercely debated questions. What is beyond dispute is that the man who emerged from his sickbed was irrevocably changed, as if the fever had burned away the last vestiges of humanity within him. Suetonius recounts that during his illness, the Roman people were so deeply concerned for their beloved emperor that they held vigils outside the palace, with some citizens even vowing to sacrifice their own lives to the gods if Caligula recovered. The irony of these prayers would become painfully clear later when those same citizens would pray with equal fervor for his death. It seemed the gods possessed a cruel sense of humor. They answered the first prayer while ensuring the second would become necessary. Upon Caligula's recovery, palace insiders immediately noticed dramatic changes in his demeanor. His voice had acquired a harsh, grating quality that made listeners uneasy, and his eyes held an unnerving intensity that seemed to penetrate through people rather than simply look at them. He began experiencing what he described as conversations with the gods, claiming that Jupiter spoke to him directly and that he could perceive divine visions inaccessible to ordinary mortals. These alleged divine communications would later serve as justification for his most extreme acts of cruelty and self-deification. The illness also seemed to unleash in Caligula an insatiable appetite for cruelty that far surpassed the casual violence considered acceptable among Roman rulers. Before his sickness, he had displayed a typical aristocratic indifference to suffering. Afterwards, he actively sought out opportunities to inflict pain and humiliation. He would spend hours devising elaborate punishments for perceived slights, reveling in the ingenuity of his tortures as much as their execution. The transformation was so complete that some historians have proposed that the illness may have caused brain damage that eradicated his capacity for empathy while leaving his intellect intact. The initial and unmistakable sign of Caligula's mental decay manifested in his increasingly erratic behavior towards those closest to him. He compelled his cherished sister Drusilla to divorce her husband and become his wife, engaging in openly incestuous relations that scandalized even the morally permissive Roman aristocracy. When Drusilla unexpectedly died in 38 AD, Caligula deified her, declaring her a goddess and making any denial of her divinity a capital offense. He remained in mourning for months, during which laughter, bathing, or dining with one's family became punishable by death. His paranoia began to manifest in lethal ways as he began to perceive conspiracies at every turn. Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator and potential rival, was forced to commit suicide based solely on Caligula's suspicion. The emperor asserted that Silanus had appeared menacing in a dream, making his death a matter of prophetic necessity. This established a terrifying precedent. Anyone who featured in Caligula's nightmares might find themselves receiving a visit from the Praetorian Guard the following morning. Caligula's relationship with the Roman Senate rapidly deteriorated as his megalomania intensified. He began to appear before them dressed as various deities, sometimes as Jupiter with a false beard and thunderbolt, other times as Neptune wielding a trident, and on occasion as Venus adorned in women's clothing and cosmetics. He demanded that senators approach him on their hands and knees, kissing his feet before being permitted to speak. Those who displayed even the slightest hesitation were marked for execution, their property seized to finance his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The emperor's mood swings became notorious for their unpredictability and ferocity. He might commence a dinner party in high spirits, entertaining guests with witty banter and elaborate amusements, only to abruptly order the execution of a random attendee for a perceived offense. Dinner guests learned to smile and laugh at his jokes while mentally preparing for the possibility that they might not survive the evening. The palace transformed into a theater of terror where a single misjudged facial expression could mean death, and silence was as perilous as speech. His delusions of grandeur reached new heights as he proclaimed direct descent from Jupiter, demanding worship as a living god. He commanded the erection of statues of himself in temples throughout the empire, replacing the heads of traditional deities with his own likeness. Citizens were obligated to offer sacrifices to his image, and any failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm in worship could result in immediate execution. In his fevered mind, the line between emperor and deity had completely blurred. As Caligula's madness deepened, his court became a spectacle of sexual excess and ritualized violence that shocked even a society accustomed to decadence. He instituted regular orgies that combined sexual debauchery with acts of extreme cruelty, compelling senators and their wives to participate while he observed from a throne-like chair, deciding who would live and who would die based on their performance. These gatherings were not merely about pleasure, they were elaborate demonstrations of power where human dignity was systematically destroyed for his entertainment. The emperor's sexual depravity recognized no boundaries or social distinctions. He would summon married women to his palace and rape them in front of their husbands, publicly rating their performance and comparing their bodies to those of famous courtesans. Suetonius records that he would invite couples to dinner, scrutinize the wives with the detached gaze of a slave trader, then force the husbands to witness his violation of their spouses. Upon returning to the dining room, he would provide detailed commentary on each woman's sexual performance, forcing their humiliated husbands to nod and smile in agreement or face execution. His sexual appetites extended far beyond conventional adultery into realms that horrified even his most debauched courtiers. He maintained a stable of male and female prostitutes for his pleasure, but also engaged in the systematic sexual abuse of both male and female members of the aristocracy. Young senators were forced to serve as his sexual playthings, while their wives and daughters were treated as imperial property to be used at will. The palace became a brothel where Roman nobility were reduced to the status of sexual slaves. The emperor's relationship with his sisters surpassed even the flexible moral limits of the Roman aristocracy. Beyond his infamous affair with Drusilla, whom he treated as his wife, historical sources suggest he engaged in sexual relationships with his other sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. He would openly fondle them at public banquets and later use them as sexual rewards for his favorites, forcing them to prostitute themselves to foreign ambassadors and wealthy Romans as demonstrations of his absolute dominion over the imperial family. Caligula's banquets became legendary theaters of sexual humiliation where the boundaries between dinner party and orgy dissolved completely. Guests were required to participate in increasingly degrading acts while dining, with sexual performance becoming a literal matter of life and death. He would force elderly senators to strip naked and perform sexual acts with young slaves while the other diners continued eating, making voyeurism and participation equally mandatory for survival. The emperor developed elaborate sexual rituals that intertwined religious ceremony with perversion. He claimed that his sexual acts were sacred rites ordained by the gods, compelling participants to treat rape and abuse as religious obligations. Women were required to worship his phallus as a sacred object, while men were forced to perform oral sex on him as a form of imperial communion. These blasphemous ceremonies transformed sexual violence into a perverted religious practice. His treatment of children was perhaps the most appalling aspect of his sexual depravity. Ancient sources record that he violated the young daughters of senators and equestrians, some barely past childhood, then forced their parents to watch and express gratitude for the honor bestowed upon their families. The innocence of children became another barrier for him to overcome in his systematic dismantling of every moral constraint that civilized society had erected. The emperor's sexual sadism manifested in elaborate punishments designed to maximize humiliation and psychological torment. He would force condemned men to watch their wives and daughters being sexually abused before their execution, transforming rape into a prelude to murder. Women who displeased him were not simply killed, but were first subjected to systematic sexual torture, their screams echoing through the palace corridors as a warning to others who might defy his will. The gladiatorial games under Caligula reached unprecedented levels of sadistic invention, blending sexual violence with public spectacle. He would force aristocrats to fight naked in the arena while being sexually assaulted by specially trained gladiators, turning combat into a form of public rape. When the supply of condemned criminals dwindled, he would order sections of the crowd to be violated before being thrown to the lions, making sexual abuse a precursor to death. The amphitheater, once a symbol of Roman engineering prowess, became a theater of sexual violence where citizens could be raped and murdered for the emperor's entertainment. Caligula's reign of terror was financed by the systematic plundering of the Roman treasury and the wealth of its citizens. Within the first year of his rule, he had squandered the enormous surplus left by the frugal Tiberius, estimated at 2.7 billion sesterces, on games, banquets, and grandiose construction projects intended to glorify his divine status. When the money ran out, he resorted to increasingly desperate and violent methods of fundraising that threatened to plunge the empire into economic ruin. His solution was to revive the treason trials that had terrorized Rome during Tiberius's reign, but with a crucial difference. While Tiberius had primarily used them for political control, Caligula used them solely for profit. Wealthy citizens found themselves accused of fabricated crimes against the emperor's divine person, their property confiscated before they were executed or forced into exile. The mere possession of wealth became a capital offense in Caligula's Rome, as the emperor regarded every affluent citizen as a potential source of funding for his excesses. The emperor implemented a series of bizarre taxes that revealed both his financial desperation and his complete disconnect from reality. He taxed lawsuits, marriages, and divorces, then extended his reach to include prostitution, gambling, and even the privilege of remaining silent during his speeches. Citizens were required to pay for the honor of being allowed to breathe in his presence, and any failure to pay these absurd levies was treated as treason. The Roman economy, built on centuries of conquest and trade, was being cannibalized to feed one man's insatiable appetite for luxury and cruelty. Perhaps the most telling indication of his madness was Caligula's decision to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul, the highest civilian office in the Roman government. The horse resided in a marble stable with an ivory manger, wore purple blankets, and had a dedicated staff of servants. While this might seem like mere eccentricity, it represented a deliberate humiliation of the Senate and the entire Roman political system. By elevating an animal to the highest human office, Caligula was declaring that he considered Roman senators to be lower than beasts. His megalomania found expression in construction projects that defied both logic and engineering feasibility. He initiated the construction of a bridge across the Bay of Naples, spanning over 3 miles, simply so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, claiming to surpass the legendary conqueror who had merely crossed the Hellespont. The bridge consumed vast resources and countless lives during its construction, only to be abandoned when Caligula lost interest in the project. Similar follies dotted the empire as the emperor's whims drained the wealth of nations. The imperial palace during Caligula's reign transformed into a labyrinth of terror, where courtiers navigated a daily gauntlet between life and death, dependent on the emperor's shifting moods. Every corridor held the potential for sudden violence, and every conversation could be a person's last. The palace staff developed an elaborate system of signals and codes to warn each other of the emperor's mental state, but even these precautions often proved inadequate when his rage erupted without warning. Caligula's private apartments were furnished with instruments of torture alongside priceless works of art, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that reflected his twisted psyche. Visitors recounted seeing iron maidens next to marble statues of Venus, while racks and thumbscrews were displayed like prized ornaments in rooms decorated with silk tapestries and gold leaf. The emperor derived personal pleasure from explaining the function of each device to his guests, often providing graphic descriptions of how they had been used on previous victims. The emperor's daily routine became a carefully orchestrated performance of cruelty designed to keep everyone around him in a perpetual state of fear. He would hold mourning audiences where he might grant a petitioner's request or order their immediate execution based on purely arbitrary criteria: the color of their toga, the sound of their voice, or simply because their face displeased him on that particular day. These audiences became gladiatorial contests of survival, where Roman citizens competed for the prize of being allowed to continue living. His sleeping quarters were equipped with multiple beds because he claimed that different gods visited him in dreams and required separate accommodations. Palace guards reported hearing him engaged in conversations with unseen entities throughout the night, sometimes laughing hysterically, other times screaming in apparent terror. When morning arrived, his nocturnal divine consultations often resulted in death sentences for people who had appeared in his dreams, making sleep itself a weapon in his arsenal of terror. The imperial kitchen became another stage for his sadistic ingenuity. Caligula would compel his guests to eat dishes prepared from human flesh, claiming it was a delicacy enjoyed by the gods. Whether the meat was actually human or merely presented as such is debated by historians, but the psychological impact was identical, reducing proud Roman citizens to cannibals through a combination of fear and meticulously crafted humiliation. The dining hall, once a place of civilized discourse, became a chamber of horrors where any meal could be your last. Caligula's relationship with the Roman military exposed the depths of his delusion and the extent to which absolute power had corrupted his judgment. Despite lacking any significant military experience, he proclaimed himself the greatest general in Roman history and embarked on campaigns that were more theatrical performances than genuine warfare. His expedition to Germany in 39 AD was characterized by bizarre conduct that alarmed even his most loyal officers. He ordered his legions to collect seashells on the beaches of Gaul, declaring them spoils of war from the conquered ocean and sending them back to Rome as trophies of his victory over Neptune. The soldiers, battle-hardened veterans of real campaigns, were forced to participate in this absurd charade, while their emperor proclaimed himself the conqueror of seas and heavens. The psychological impact on the legions was devastating. They had sworn oaths to follow a commander who was demonstrably insane, yet desertion meant death for them and their families. His treatment of military officers reflected his escalating paranoia and his need to degrade those who might pose a threat to his power. He forced centurions to strip naked and crawl through mud while he watched from his litter, mocking their humiliation. Senior officers were required to run alongside his chariot for miles, and those who showed signs of exhaustion were executed for insufficient devotion to their emperor. The Roman military, built on discipline and mutual respect between commanders and soldiers, was being systematically dismantled by one man's madness. The emperor's obsession with his divine status extended to his military commands, where he would claim to receive battle orders directly from the gods. He would halt entire armies to commune with invisible deities, forcing thousands of soldiers to wait in formation while he engaged in conversations with the empty air. These episodes could last for hours, during which any soldier who expressed skepticism or impatience would be marked for punishment. The logistics of maintaining an army ground to a standstill when the commanding officer was more preoccupied with his divine hallucinations than with military strategy. Perhaps the most revealing demonstration of his military incompetence was his planned invasion of Britain, which he abandoned at the last moment, claiming that Neptune had warned him against crossing the English Channel. Instead of admitting failure, he declared victory over the British without ever setting foot on their shores, then returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph based on entirely fictional conquests. The Roman people, desperate to believe in their emperor's competence, participated in the celebration, even though many suspected the truth. By 41 AD, Caligula's reign of terror had pushed even his closest supporters to the breaking point. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal protectors of the imperial family, had become instruments of his cruelty, forced to carry out increasingly bizarre and violent orders that violated every principle of Roman honor and military discipline. The officers who had sworn to protect the emperor with their lives began to perceive him as a greater threat to Rome than any foreign adversary. Cassius Dio, a senior centurion of the Praetorian Guard, emerged as the leader of the conspiracy against Caligula. Dio had been repeatedly humiliated by the emperor, who ridiculed his high-pitched voice and forced him to use passwords like Priapus and Venus, which were designed to embarrass a career soldier. The personal humiliation, coupled with his growing horror at Caligula's atrocities, motivated Dio to rid Rome of its mad emperor before the empire collapsed entirely. The conspiracy included senators, equestrians, and freedmen who had all suffered under Caligula's arbitrary rule. What united these diverse plotters was not political ideology, but the instinct for self-preservation. They understood that as long as Caligula lived, no one in Rome was safe from his paranoid delusions and sadistic whims. The conspiracy was remarkable for its broad support across all social classes, indicating that Caligula had managed to unite the entire city against him through the sheer extremity of his cruelty. The final catalyst occurred during the Palatine Games in January 41 AD when Caligula announced his intention to relocate permanently to Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a living god without the constraints of Roman tradition. He also revealed plans to massacre the entire Senate and replace them with his horse and other favorites, effectively extinguishing the Roman Republic forever. The conspirators recognized that they had to act immediately or witness their civilization descend into the abyss of one man's madness. The plot was meticulously timed for the changing of the guard when the palace would be most vulnerable. The conspirators had studied Caligula's daily routine and identified the narrow corridor beneath the palace where he would be most isolated from his loyal Germanic bodyguards. Every detail was planned with military precision, reflecting the professional competence of the Praetorian officers who had ultimately determined that their oath to Rome superseded their oath to the emperor. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula attended the final day of the Palatine Games, watching theatrical performances that ironically included scenes of assassination and political violence. The emperor seemed to revel in the fictional murders on stage, oblivious to the fact that his own death was being plotted in the shadows surrounding him. As the day progressed, his Germanic bodyguards noticed unusual activity among the Praetorian officers, but their warnings were ignored by an emperor who had become convinced of his own invincibility. As Caligula left the theater to return to his palace for lunch, he chose to take a shortcut through the narrow underground passage that the conspirators had designated as their killing ground. Cassius Dio and his fellow plotters waited in the shadows, their swords drawn and their resolve fortified by years of witnessing unimaginable atrocities. The moment the emperor entered the corridor, separated from his loyal guards, the conspirators struck with the fury of men who had witnessed too much evil. The assassination was swift and brutal. Dio delivered the first blow, slashing deeply into Caligula's jaw and neck, while the other conspirators stabbed repeatedly until the emperor collapsed in a pool of his own blood. According to Suetonius, Caligula died with 30 wounds on his body, each representing the accumulated rage of those who had suffered under his reign. His final words were reportedly, "I am still alive," a desperate assertion of the immortality he had claimed as a god, now disproved by the stark reality of his mortality. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the extent to which fear had paralyzed the Roman government. The Senate, instead of celebrating their liberation, initially panicked at the news of Caligula's death, terrified that his Germanic guards would massacre them in retaliation. The Praetorian Guard themselves were divided between those who had participated in the conspiracy and those who remained loyal to the imperial family. For several hours, the fate of the empire hung precariously in the balance, as various factions struggled to determine who would rule Rome. The conspirators had successfully planned the assassination, but failed to prepare for the succession, an oversight that nearly plunged Rome into civil war. The discovery of Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace provided an unexpected solution. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor, driven more by desperation than by conviction. The choice proved fortunate for Rome, as Claudius would restore stability and competent governance to an empire that had teetered on the brink of destruction due to 4 years of madness. The reign of terror had ended, but the scars it etched upon Roman society would take decades to heal. The assassination of Caligula marked the conclusion of one of history's most psychologically disturbing reigns, but the effects of his 4 years of terror resonated far beyond his death. The Roman Empire had been fundamentally transformed by the experience of absolute tyranny, and the institutions that had once seemed unassailable were revealed to be as fragile as the sanity of the man who governed them. The conspiracy that resulted in his death demonstrated both the resilience of human dignity in the face of extreme oppression and the ultimate vulnerability of unchecked power. Ancient historians struggled to comprehend how a civilization as sophisticated as Rome could have produced and tolerated such a monster. Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's death, still seemed incredulous at the sheer scope of the emperor's cruelty, while Tacitus employed the reign as a cautionary tale about the inherent dangers of absolute power. These writers understood that Caligula was not simply an anomaly, but a warning about what can occur when institutional safeguards fail and power becomes concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The deliberate attempt to erase Caligula from memory, the damnatio memoriae ordered by the Senate, revealed the Romans' desperate need to expunge the trauma of his reign from their collective consciousness. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were defaced, and official records were altered to minimize references to the mad emperor. Yet this very endeavor to forget ironically ensured that future generations would remember, as the extremity of the erasure testified to the extremity of the crimes being concealed. Modern historians have debated the precise nature of Caligula's mental illness, proposing theories ranging from temporal lobe epilepsy to bipolar disorder to simple psychopathy exacerbated by absolute power. What remains irrefutable is that his reign demonstrated how quickly civilized society can crumble when leadership is entrusted to someone who combines unlimited authority with complete moral bankruptcy. The Roman Empire survived Caligula, but it was permanently scarred by the realization that such horrors were possible. The parallels between Caligula's reign and other instances of absolute tyranny throughout history are both striking and terrifying. The pattern of initial popularity followed by increasing paranoia, the use of spectacle and violence to maintain control, the systematic dismantling of institutional safeguards, and the ultimate reliance on fear rather than legitimacy. These elements have been repeated by tyrants throughout the ages. Caligula's example serves as a potent reminder that the capacity for evil is not limited by time, place, or culture, but is an intrinsic aspect of human nature that must be restrained by law, custom, and the courage of those who refuse to remain silent in the face of atrocity. The story of Caligula compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and human nature. It reminds us that civilized behavior is not the default state of humanity, but an achievement that must be constantly maintained and defended. When we witness the systematic erosion of human dignity, when we observe power wielded without restraint or accountability, when we see human beings reduced to objects for the amusement of their rulers, we are confronting the same forces that transformed a promising young Roman prince into one of history's most infamous monsters. The lesson of Caligula transcends ancient Rome. It speaks to the eternal vigilance required to prevent such horrors from recurring in any time or place where human beings exercise power over other human beings. The chilling echoes of his reign serve as a timeless warning, a stark reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the seeds of tyranny can take root even in the most fertile soil of civilization. So, as we've journeyed through the dark and twisted corridors of Caligula's reign, I hope the central message has resonated, that unchecked power, divorced from empathy and accountability, can corrupt even the most promising beginnings. The story of Caligula isn't just a historical horror show, it's a timeless lesson about the fragility of civilization and the ever-present need to safeguard against tyranny. What are your thoughts on Caligula? Did anything in particular surprise or resonate with you? I'd love to hear your perspectives and answer any questions you might have in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you found this exploration of history insightful and thought-provoking, please consider subscribing. That way you won't miss out on future deep dives into the stories and lessons that shape our world. Thanks for watching.